It's time for story time. So gather around. I'm going to read you all a story. This is from a book called Story Train. And this is an old book that I found in Caroline's room. This book was copyrighted in 1965, so it's an old one. I'm going to read you a story. Hope you all enjoy it. It's called Where Were the Rubbers? One day, Mrs. Goose could not find her rubbers. She looked in the closet where she always puts her rubbers. They were not there. She looked all around the house. She looked under all the chairs. She could not find her rubbers. Mrs. Goose said, "Where can my rubbers be? I will go over to Mrs. Pig's house. I will ask her if she has seen my rubbers." Mrs. Goose went to Mrs. Pig's house. Mrs. Pig was coming out of her house. She looked at Mrs. Goose. "What can I do for you?" she said. Mrs. Goose said, "I cannot find my rubbers. I have looked and looked for them. Have you seen my rubbers?" "Your rubbers?" said Mrs. Pig. "I have not seen your rubbers. They would not be in my house. Ask Mrs. Squirrel if she has seen your rubbers." Mrs. Goose said, "I will go to Mrs. Squirrel's house. I will ask her if she has seen my rubbers." Mrs. Goose went to Mrs. Squirrel's house. She saw Mrs. Squirrel under a tree. "Oh, Mrs. Squirrel," called Mrs. Goose, "I cannot find my rubbers. I have looked all over for them. Have you seen them?" "No, I have not seen your rubbers," said Mrs. Squirrel. "Your rubbers would not be in my house. Go home and look in your house again. I know that you will find your rubbers there." Hope she finds her rubbers. Mrs. Goose went back to her home. She looked all around the house again. She looked in her bed. She looked under her pillow. She looked in her closet again. Then she went into her garden. She looked all around the garden. She began to dig in the garden. She could not find her rubbers. Mrs. Sheep came down the road. She saw Mrs. Goose looking around the garden. "What are you looking for?" asked Miss Sheep. "I am looking for my rubbers," said Mrs. Goose. "I have looked all around my house. I have looked all around my garden. I cannot find my rubbers." "Where do you keep your rubbers?" asked Mrs. Sheep. "I always put my rubbers in a bag in my closet," said Mrs. Goose. "My rubbers are not there now." Mrs. Sheep looked at Mrs. Goose and she said, "Why do you want your rubbers now? It is not raining." "It may be raining in the morning," said Mrs. Goose. "I want my rubbers when it rains." "Yes, it may rain," said Mrs. Sheep. "I do not know where my rubbers are. I will go home to look for them now." Mrs. Goose went into her house again. She looked and looked for her rubbers. She looked in her big clock. She looked behind all the doors. At last, Mrs. Goose said, "I will go to bed. I may find my rubbers in the morning." The next morning, Mrs. Goose heard the rain coming down on the roof. She looked out of a window. There was water in the garden. There was water in the road. There was water everywhere. Mrs. Goose said, "I have nothing to eat in my house. I must go to town today. I do not want to walk around in the rain. I must find my rubbers. Where did I put my rubbers?" Mrs. Goose went to the closet. She put on her coat. She put on a little hat. She took her big red umbrella out of the closet. She walked out of the door with the big red umbrella in her hand. Mrs. Goose put up her big umbrella. Plop, plop, something fell on the grass near Mrs. Goose. She looked down, and there were her rubbers on the grass. "Oh no, now I know what I did with my rubbers," she said. "I put them in my umbrella." Well, I don't know about you all, but I'm glad Mrs. Goose found her rubbers. She would have gotten into a sticky situation. We'll see you later.